Hi, I'm Maggie, and I love horror. I love horror movies, I love horror novels, I love horror short stories, horror video games, and I also love talking about books. So I decided to combine my passions to create a virtual haunted book club. And what better time to start it than Halloween time, October? And what better way to start than picking a classic horror novel that people have been talking about for years and years and years? People have been making movies, people have been making songs, ballets, every form of adaptation you could probably think of, there is a version of this. And I am talking about, of course, Dracula by Bram Stoker. Now, as someone who got an English degree, I somehow got around reading a lot of classic, quote unquote, novels, and typically that's okay with me. I don't love the tenets of the literary canon as it's been institutionalized over hundreds of years. Obviously, it's very biased, not a lot of representation. And so, usually, it's fine with me to kind of pick and choose what I want from that to read. But I am genuinely pleasantly surprised by this book. I'm very excited to be reading it. I had some misguided assumptions about older horror novels. I've read a couple, but I think I generally have the bias that older horror is scary in a more subtle, environmental, ambient way. I feel like sometimes it's more of about weirdness, and it's not maybe as acutely scary as some modern horror. And I find myself to be pleasantly surprised by how scary parts of this book are. So I'm very excited to talk about it, and I'm going to be breaking it apart into four sections. I'm going to do about a quarter of the book at a time. So today, in my edition, I have the 2015 Barnes& and Noble edition. I'm going through page 108, which is through chapter 8, right before chapter 9 starts. So I'm going to be posting throughout the rest of the month. And if you're doing the math, there are not 4 weeks left, obviously. So I'm going to be posting my second part next week. And then in celebration of Halloween, I'll do the last two parts the last week of October. Hopefully it's early enough that if you wanted to grab a copy and read along and catch up, talk about it, share your thoughts, there's still time for that. And you can do it before Halloween starts. So let's get into it. I'm not going to get into right now the debate over his inspirations for Dracula. There's a lot of scholarship, a lot of people writing about this. I think there's a lot of analysis around, who or what inspired Dracula. Folks like Vlad the Impaler or Elizabeth Bathory, they're more European vampire lore. I think obviously there's vampire or vampire-like lore in other cultures. I'm less familiar with lore behind that, and I think Dracula obviously is a very European take on the lore. What I will say is that as we're going through, I did learn about some historical events that Stoker was drawing from, some specific events that show up in his narrative as we go along and we're talking about the plot. I'll get into them that I find really interesting and kind of lend to this angle he's taking that he's trying to make it feel like it could be real. So Dracula is an epistolary novel, which means it's written in the perspective of people's writing. So we have Jonathan Harker's journals where we start. We have his fiancee Mina's journal and her letters with her friend Lucy. We have articles about events that happen. We have captain's logs. We have different forms of writing that allow the narrative to unfold that way. And what really lends to this idea that Stoker's trying to make it seem like it could be real. Like this is people writing about their experiences and that this is like found material, a collection of found materials, like found footage before found footage, um, is that in my edition at the very beginning, the disclaimer, you might say at the beginning, reads, "How these papers have been placed in sequence will be made manifest in the reading of them. All needless matters have been eliminated, so that a history almost at variance with the possibilities of latter-day belief may stand forth as simple fact. There is throughout no statement of past events wherein memory may err, for all the records chosen are exactly contemporary, given from the standpoints and within the range of knowledge of those who made them." So he's kind of playing with, the reader. As I'm reading this, I keep thinking about if I was someone in 1897 or 1898, or even just a couple years after this was published, before the internet made it even easier to find out about plots or to hear people talking about books. And I didn't know what I was in for. And I picked up this new book. I would be losing it. Like I couldn't imagine what it'd be like to read this book when it was published, when it came out. I will be honest, I was a child when I watched it, but when I saw the Blair Witch Project, I was convinced that was real. I was so convinced, and I was terrified. I was like, what do you mean there's a witch in the woods that kills people? It's terrifying. And so if I had any doubt when this book, I don't know. And I think the fact that there are some real events that Stoker integrates into the novel, I would be I I would be this close probably to writing the publisher and just being like, "Hey, what?" So that's also kind of fun. Like I think being an early reader of Dracula, I would love to know what that experience would have been like. Um as I was looking into this novel a little more, I found out that the original manuscript, weirdly enough, was found in 1980, so almost 100 years after it was published, in a barn in Pennsylvania. And it had, Stoker's notes in the margins, it had an alternate name, title. Um, and from that, it was discovered that the editors, when they were preparing this book to be published, took a lot of the original content out, really trimmed it down, and a lot of that was from the beginning of the book. So the version as we know it now starts in the middle of Jonathan's journal, kind of right at the start of the plot. You're really thrust into the action. There's not a lot of buildup, and I really liked that. I kind of loved the fact that you're just going. You're following Jonathan. You're right in the midst of it. There's no kind of preamble or anything. And so that's where I'm going to start. I'm going to start talking about the actual plot. Chapters 1 through 4 really are Jonathan Harker's journal. And we're starting, he is on his trip. He is on his way to go to the estate of a nobleman from Transylvania named Count Dracula. And Count Dracula is a client of his law office who used their services to purchase property in London. So Jonathan Harker is a young lawyer, solicitor, and the fact that he's a very fresh lawyer, I think is an important character point for Jonathan. He describes just having passed exams, the requirements to become a solicitor in England, and he comes off as pretty inexperienced, pretty eager, but also a little bit, I don't want to say necessarily naive, but he's definitely inexperienced. He's establishing himself. And I think that plays into some of his reactions to things. His willingness to go on this trip and kind of see this through, his desire to do the tasks that his employer gives him and to really prove himself. I think maybe that pushes him further along than some people might go on this journey, but also how he reacts to certain things. I think his uh, his relationship to authority and power, because he's a young man in a profession that takes a lot of work. I think that really plays into how he interacts with people, specifically Dracula. So I just want to note that. But anyway, he's talking about his journey like a lot of people going to a new place, a lot of tourists. You might think of your family member who's talking about the beautiful landscape and the meals that they're eating and how they want the recipes to bring home to learn to make at home. But also he has this kind of perspective of a typical white man traveling to a new place, very Western touristy kind of approach, where he's also talking about the people, the locals, and their customs, their attire. It's being kind of strange or quaint, or what he really harps on is their superstitions. He's very he talks about their superstitions a lot in that way, as superstitions. And obviously, it's never a great idea or thoughtful or appropriate to look at the local customs of people that you're unfamiliar with and kind of write them off as superstitious. And for Jonathan, that proves to be a big mistake. So when he's on his journey and he's telling people that he's going to visit this count, they all start to act very strangely, and they start to whisper amongst themselves and encourage him, beg him not to go, which I think, if you're in a place and you don't know the local dynamics, the local culture, the local, customs, and someone seems really concerned about you going somewhere or seeing a specific person, I think you should take that to heart. I know it's business, but I would not be assuming I know better. I would be, if a woman, as happens in this book, hands me a crucifix to protect myself, I would certainly be rethinking this appointment I have. But he's just observing it as a superstition. He's not even understanding everything they're saying. There's so many dialects happening in these conversations. He's trying to look up words in his dictionary. But he even says at one point, as a Protestant looking at a crucifix, he views it as almost like a blasphemy or an idolatry that he, as in his religious practice doesn't believe in or practice. And he kind of just continues on his way. And it's not until, he's getting closer, he's picked up by this strange carriage driver, that he notices that something maybe not right. Maybe something is off. I don't know if it's the pack of wolves following his carriage or the fact that the carriage driver just kind of is able to dismiss them through some command over these wolves, or if it's the fact that the carriage driver is driving in circles to pass some time. Maybe it's all of these things that really convince Jonathan that something feels not right. And Count Dracula opens the door, and you're not meeting the Dracula that many of us have met in some more of the familiar film adaptations. I think of slicked back hair, cape. Maybe I'm thinking too modern, but I'm thinking fancy Dracula, and this guy's fancy, but he's fancy in a different way. He's described as this large, old man. He's old, he's aged, and he's got a long white mustache. And I am not familiar with many adaptations of Dracula with a mustache, except Robert Eggers' Nosferatu. And we have our mustache count. He opens the door. And if this is not the most vampire type greeting, and granted, I know we have the benefit of being modern readers with, vampire lore being cemented in pop culture history. But if this is not the most vampire type greeting to say, he goes, quote, "Welcome to my house. Enter freely and of your own will." We all know vampires need to be invited in explicitly into any place. That's that's pretty on the nose. But I also think there's this interesting foreshadowing of this idea of the illusion of freedom, especially when it comes to Jonathan and being in Dracula's house that we'll get into. But it's this false sense, I think, of free will. I mean, even the machinations of getting Jonathan to Dracula's estate, um, you know, those weren't just by chance. I don't think Dracula's, just flying by the seat of his pants here. So, again, another red flag. And Jonathan, I don't know if he doesn't know how to handle it. I don't know if he's still trying to be dismissive of this being something, to be overly concerned about. But Dracula, to be fair, is kind of immediately disarming. And he's got this hospitality about him, and he even has this kind of false humility. He's, saying, please correct my English. It's not very good. I want to learn how to speak properly, even though he's speaking very proper, eloquent English. And so he's got these immediately disarming qualities. But over the next couple days, there's things that make Jonathan recognize that there truly is something off about this man. There's something intangibly off-putting about him, but also they only talk at night, and they talk all through the night. They'd never talk during the day. Pretty spot on vampire stuff, Jonathan starts to notice there's not any servants around the castle. And, for an aristocrat who is speaking as if there are servants in the house, it's very odd when Jonathan sees Dracula doing all of the housework, putting out the meals, preparing for Jonathan in his quarters. That, to me, for some reason, was really eerie to read. That part where Jonathan's looking at Dracula, kind of spying on him and seeing him doing these, household chores. One time he has his shaving mirror open and Dracula's right behind him and he doesn't see him in the mirror. Again, not that Jonathan's going into this knowing all the vampire lore, but no reflection. That's very unnatural and very vampire. So, and Stoker's really teeing up all these, vampire lore aspects for us. Jonathan starts to get curious. He walks around the house, around the castle, when Dracula's away, sleeping. And he realizes that all the doors and windows are locked or barred, or he cannot exit. He is a prisoner. Surprise, surprise. He is a prisoner in this castle. So Jonathan starts freaking out. He's trying to figure out how to get out of here, or what to do even. He recognizes that he is at the mercy of this weird guy, this weird count. And that's a very scary feeling. He realizes that he can't let on that he knows because he doesn't know the count's intentions. He's in a predicament for sure. And one night he spots the count climbing out of his window. And if that isn't weird enough, he starts scaling the side of the castle like a lizard. And that to me was another surprisingly terrifying description of Dracula. Moving like a lizard. Because I can imagine exactly. I've seen little lizards out camping and in the desert and the way they move. And I'm imagining an old human man doing that on the side of a building. And that is so unsettling to see in the middle of the night. So one night, while Dracula's on his reptilian-like excursion out of the castle, Jonathan is going around the castle and he finds a door that's not locked and it leads to this room that appears to have been women's chambers. And he is like, you know what? I'm going to lay down, I'm going to sleep in this room because I don't want to feel like a prisoner in the room that Dracula has designated for me. And interesting form of rebellion, interesting choice. Not one I would choose. I don't think I'd feel safer or like I was accomplishing anything sleeping in another dusty old room in this castle. But, stick it to the man where you can. And he, in what he thinks is a dream, encounters these three beautiful women. And they approach him while he's laying down and lean over him as if to kiss him. And this is a moment of Jonathan feeling some sort of way. He's feeling attracted to these women. He's feeling the desire to kiss these women. But he's also thinking of his fiancée, who he references throughout his writings, of Mina. And he he even says, I hope Mina never reads this. I don't want to hurt her, but I really wanted to kiss that lady. And, who could blame him? Beautiful vampire ladies. Who. Anyways, he is laying there. They're leaning over him in a way that at first appears to be like they're going to kiss him. But then Dracula comes into the room and is freaking out. He's like, leave this man alone. He's mine. He is mine. And he kind of implies that as soon as I'm done with this man, you can have him. But right now, he's mine. And Harker, he's writing about this experience the next day after he's woken up. Because he's still trying to, I think, protect his sanity by maybe thinking it's a dream. But I think he's beginning to understand that perhaps it's not a dream, not in his head. He realizes that Dracula has an intention for him, and the outcome doesn't look so good for Jonathan. It's not looking good. So, he is desperate to get out. One of the other things that he observes is that Dracula, on his weird excursion, starts bringing back packages. Packages that make noises like crying and wailing. And it becomes pretty apparent that Dracula is bringing back packages of babies or infants to these creepy ladies to eat, to kind of satisfy their hunger long enough that he can do what he wants with Jonathan before, they get too antsy. And this is, again, one of the parts where I was so shocked at how scary it was and how eerie and off-putting it was for an older novel. I would not have expected an author in the late 1800s, Victorian era, to be writing about a scene where a woman comes to the castle gates, distraught, crying to get her baby back from the castle because Dracula has kidnapped her child. And she's wailing and pounding at the gates, demanding her child be returned to her, asking for her child back. And Dracula calls the wolves on her, and she's torn apart by these wolves to the point where there's nothing left. That is horrifying. That's messed up. That's dark. That's bleak. It's scary. It's so morbid. I was shocked by the type of horror that Stoker's presenting. There is something very visceral and dark and unforgiving about that, So, again, kind of shaking up my preconceived notions here. So Jonathan's chapters begin to wrap up, with him really getting to the point of desperation, needing to get out, knowing that Dracula has some plan for him, that he's got, his days are numbered, before whatever Dracula is intending to do is going to happen. And so he's sneaking around. At one point, he climbs across the ledge into Dracula's room, finds it empty, is searching around, finds a passage to the chapel on the grounds. And there he finds Dracula asleep. He appears alive, but also dead, in a box in the chapel. And desperately, Jonathan picks up a shovel and tries to kill him with it, but it deflects, and he's unable to kill Dracula. But Dracula doesn't get up. I think there's, again, that vampire logic of the vampires during the day are asleep or unable to engage in the daytime. So, Jonathan's kind of running out of options here. He's really got very few things he can do. And so it kind of ends on him being so desperate and stuck. At one point, he asks Dracula to leave. He says, I want to leave the castle now. And Dracula says, all right, go ahead, walk out the door. I'll open it for you. And he opens it, and the pack of wolves that we've seen throughout these first couple chapters are there. And he realizes that, he doesn't really have a choice. Dracula's giving him this, illusion, but he's really sending the message of, Jonathan, you can't leave. You can leave if you want to get eaten by wolves. So this false notion of choice. So anyway, chapter 4, Jonathan's last chapter of his journal in this section, ends with him getting so desperate to leave that he decides he's going to climb down the side of the castle, and he's kind of giving it his last farewell of, this is my last ditch effort to get out of here. So that's where that section ends. The next sections, chapters 5 and 6, jump to Mina. Mina is his fiance, her perspective. And it's the first part is letters between her and her friend Lucy. And Lucy's talking about her romance situation. And this is kind of a little fun jump, I guess, from the horrors of Dracula's castle. We're going to some fun little gossip. Some fun little back and forth between friends. And Lucy's talking about how all of a sudden she has been pursued by 3 suitors. Dr. John Seward, Arthur Holmwood, and an American from Texas named Quincy Morris. And so there's this fun little rom-com-y plot there about her being pursued by these 3 men, forming friendships with all of them, but really she loves Arthur. Truly, that's the person she loves. So she describes having to turn down these men, and it's very sad, and they're all, supportive. But then they all write letters to each other asking to celebrate Arthur's engagement to Lucy, to celebrate that he, and Lucy found each other. I can't tell if the 3 of these men were friends before, if they became friends or wanted to just meet because they all loved Lucy and have respect for her, if there's some weird setup here, like a classic, albeit, problematic rom-com plot of these 3 guys going, there's this girl unlucky in love, let's have a competition to see who can get her to agree to marry them first, and then they all end up genuinely falling in love with her. I don't know what the dynamic behind it is, but that's a part of the story. Eventually she does get engaged to Arthur, her true love. And then we get into Mina's journals, and it turns out she is staying in Whitby with Lucy and her family, Lucy's mother and Lucy, while Jonathan's away. Mina is Jonathan's fiance, and while he's on his trip, she's staying with Lucy, and writing in her journals about this town, this ruined abbey in town that's reputed to be haunted, how she spends days in the cemetery sitting on this favorite bench, and how she meets this old man named Mr. Swales and become friends. And Mr. Swales is an interesting character because he's kind of this big personality for an old man, kind of the guy at the pub who's kind of loud and tells a lot of stories, but seems somehow really likable. And he also is this weird literary function. He kind of portends death. There's one point where he talks to Mina, and he's talking about how afraid he is of his own death, his own impending death. So he's kind of this censor that's going off saying, I feel this impending death. And you could write off as he's old. He's older. People have a greater sense of mortality. Or it could be almost like a carbon monoxide detector telling you something's coming, something's not good, get out, we can sense that there's something bad in the air. And he's associated with his own mortality, but, doom generally is on the way. Also in this section, you get glimpses of Dr. Seward's journal, one of Lucy's suitors, who she did not pick. And he's actually works as a psychiatrist. He works in a hospital for people with mental illnesses. And he is writing, first of all, about how sad he is that Lucy didn't pick him, but also, more importantly, sorry, not to diminish your feelings, but about this patient named Renfield, who has come under his care. And Renfield, we just had that Renfield movie, another Nick Cage film. I don't know if anyone follows Nick Cage's movie career lately. Another adaptation, but from the perspective of Renfield, his assistant, as you might say. That has not yet been revealed in the plot, but I'm not spoiling it. This book's been around for forever. Anyway, so Renfield is in this hospital because he has these delusions of of dedication to this unnamed master, almost this like religious fervor of dedication, but also this idea of power, of gaining power through his dedication to his master. And this idea of power is again coming up in Renfield's dynamic. He is described consuming as many lives as possible as being his goal, gaining power through the mass consumption of life. Again, a very good foreshadowing of what it is vampires do. But the way Renfield does it as a human, presumably at this point, is that he starts by collecting all these flies. And then he collects spiders and feeds the flies to the spiders. Then he gets birds and feeds the spiders to the birds. So that this big group of flies have been eaten by this small group of spiders. These spiders are being consumed by birds, almost like a pyramid. And he wants to get a cat to eat the spiders, but the birds. But when he's not allowed to get a cat, he eats the birds. So this idea of consumption, but kind of streamlining it so we can get as much life out of it as possible through this pyramid style food chain. So that was very, very also gross part of this book. We also, we go back to Mina's journals after that. And Mina's talking about how Lucy starts to sleepwalk. And, again, I think it's teeing up, it's getting us prepared for something. This eeriness of night, this liminality of not being awake, but being awake. You're moving, you're not awake, but you're walking. And what's driving her to get up in the night. Those are kind of like the lingering what's happening. The narrative switches pretty strongly from journal writing to an article about a boat that crashes into the coast of Whitby. And at first, it's very mysterious why this boat crashed into the shore. It's a stormy night, and they say that the only person on this boat was the captain, and he was tied to the wheel. So the town's trying to figure out what happened to the ship and where the crew went and who's responsible for the crew disappearing. The reporter who's writing these articles, and this is proposed as articles that Mina put into her journal. So it's still framed in Mina's journal. Again, this found material. And the reporter gains access to the captain's log. And the captain's log tells the very haunting story of the Demeter, which is actually a reference to a ship that did crash into the shore of Whitby, a Russian ship that had very few crew members left, and it was called the Dmitri. And so it's a slight change. It's the Demeter different, obviously. And both boats were carrying boxes of earth, of soil, as their cargo. But what's different, there's people say with the Dmitri, a dog did jump off the boat as soon as it hit shore. The Demeter in Stoker's novel, a dog also jumps off the boat. However, as we learn by reading it, we discover that the cargo on the ship was an entity, a being that started to kill off the crew one by one. And I'm sure we can all put together, tie the loose ends together. Dracula was in these crates of earth that were on the ship, and at night he sneaks out and he starts eating the crew members and disposing of them. We find this out because of the captain's journal that the reporter gains access to, and the captain's writing about day by day how more and more men go missing, how his first mate is going crazy, is losing his mind over this, and then eventually the captain realizes that there is an evil entity on board, and the last effort he has to die with his ship, to go down with the ship like a captain does, and to maintain some kind of honor, is to tie himself to the wheel. And basically, he does that before dying, and then the ship crashes into the shore. There is a recent movie, I haven't seen it yet, called The Last Voyage of the Demeter, another film adaptation. So I'm hoping maybe to get through some of these movies once I finish the book. Maybe I can talk about them some more. I'm definitely going to watch Bram Stoker's Dracula. I've not seen that movie yet either. Very excited to get into some of these adaptations and see. Because that's another very eerie part. I think the image of this boat crashing and only one man left and he's dead, tied to the steering wheel, is a very memorable and scary image. As an after image in my brain that is going to stick with me for long after reading this book. And that's something that did not make it into the Robert Eggers version. And I'm not exactly sure why, because I thought that was, maybe it was for time, maybe it's for conciseness, maybe he was choosing to focus on other things. And that's a whole nother story in of itself. As we see, it's a whole chapter of captain's logs and articles. But I thought it was terrifying. So scary. Um, so the town is reeling after this crash. They're trying to do a funeral for the captain. And try to figure out what happened to this crew, what happened to the ship. And shortly after the crash, Mr. Swales, Mina's friend, is found dead in the cemetery, as if he had died by fright. He had this horrified expression on his face. And that's kind of glossed over a little bit. I mean, it's a very quick revelation. I think in part because Mina's got a lot of other stuff happening, which I'll explain. At the time, maybe she can't spend too much time grieving this or really, thinking about how odd this really is. But this comes after his, kind of foreshadowing the way he portends death to her. So that's a really, again, these ominous signs one after the other, this impending doom, really cast a shadow, I think, over this plot and the characters. But I think Mina, she doesn't have enough information, I think, to really make sense out of these signs. Or maybe she's trying not to, because who would want to see doom, in front of them? Meanwhile, Lucy's sleepwalking has gotten worse. And she, one night, leaves the house and makes it all the way to the graveyard. And Mina gets frantic looking for her. And finally, she finds her sitting on their bench. And leaning over Lucy is this shadowy figure. And as Mina approaches, the figure disappears. And she's able to get Lucy home. Again, Mina doesn't dwell on this very much. I think I would be freaking out trying to figure out what was leaning over my friend. But I think Mina's so preoccupied with making sure Lucy's home and okay, and really making sure that, no one sees them. This propriety issue of Lucy being out at night in her nightgown is a big issue. I think Mina's very preoccupied with people not knowing about it. And I think that has a lot to do with like social norms at the time. And also just the well-being of her friend. Maybe she is so focused on that she doesn't want to dwell on this shadowy figure. But that I was a little surprised that she's not interrogating that more. But regardless, she gets Lucy home, and Lucy seems to be doing well, except she has these marks on her neck. And she seems very, despite being healthy, pale. And so there's this still, despite her being home and maybe Mina feeling a little relieved that's over, that she seems to be okay, something's not quite right. Right after that, again, Mina's, doesn't have time really to sit with these things because she gets a letter from a Hungarian hospital saying that her husband-to-be, Harker, is in the hospital with brain fever. He was discovered traveling and didn't really have anything on him for them to identify who he was, and he's had this brain fever, and so it took them a while to identify him and be able to write. But he's recovering in the hospital, and Mina's requested to go tend to him. So I think she's kind of like, all right, Lucy, you got settled down here. I got to go take care of Harker, of my love. And, I think she's distracted or pulled away from these things and maybe doesn't have time to start thinking about, well, what killed Swales? What was leaning over Lucy? What is going on around me? Um, and then one last kind of big important plot point of this section is that Seward in his journal describes a night where Renfield becomes all of a sudden worked up. He's getting not anxious but excited because he says his master's here. His master's coming, and he escapes. And they realize he's dangerous. He's, again, experiencing what they believe to be delusions. So they're very desperate to find him, and they follow him to the Carfax estate, the same estate that Dracula, surprise, surprise, purchased in London. And he is found at the chapel door on that property trying to get in. And so they're able to apprehend Renfield again. But I think, again, that's another indication of Dracula's arrival. Stoker's clever in that, he can't outright say Dracula's here because Mina wouldn't know who Dracula is. The people from the perspective he's writing wouldn't have that information, but he gives all of these context clues. So that's what's happened so far. Sorry, that's a very long description. But like I said, it's a very meaty book. There's a lot happening here. And there's a lot of content. And a lot of it is interesting or important to the plot or guides us along. It's this unfolding of events in a way where, he, as an omniscient third-person narrator, you could just describe what's happening. But Stoker is writing it in such a way that he has to include these plot points in different narrative techniques so that we as a reader can piece it together without him giving us a full plot, a full explicit rundown of events. And that's not easy. I also really appreciate his ability to write from different character perspectives. That's not easy, to change your voice and style between characters as an author. And I'm not saying that each voice is very distinct or different. I think, there's some conventions of the time that lend itself to some consistency in word choice and everything like that. But I do appreciate that in form and style, he's varying it. And, he's got articles, he's got captain's log, he's toying with form here. And I think he does a good job of it. I think it's done very well. So kudos. Again, another thing I surprisingly enjoy and makes the book so much more engaging and easy to read than what, I have found sometimes to be a stuffier narrative voice when it's in older books and kind of this omniscient third-person perspective sometimes tend to be a little bit more dense and a little bit harder to get into. But I think they're not a casualness, but an approachability of using journals and people writing in a more direct way. So I just want to talk about, I know, I've been talking. Like I said, I love to yap, but just some things that really stood out to me in this section. One being, like I mentioned, these power dynamics and navigating power and characters who crave power or have power or manipulate people versus people who don't have power or don't crave it in the same way. Like I think Jonathan is aware of it and plays into power structures and dynamics interpersonally and with these people in his life or with Dracula, but he's not as calculated, about it. Renfield obviously being an example of someone who seeking power through devotion to his master. One of the main themes that I really appreciated, that I'm really interested in, is the friendship aspect. And it's something I didn't expect, but I was really interested in the dynamics of friendships. Primarily, you have Mina and Lucy, and they have a very close friendship, very intimate, very close bonded women who, at the time, they're both without their partners because Arthur's away with his family. He and Lucy are not married. Mina's not married yet, and her fiance is also away. So they kind of rely on each other. And women at this time, obviously, there's a lot of rules around propriety and women not having as much social power, but there's something about them taking care of one another and this closeness they have, the way they look out for one another. Um, I just find it so interesting. And then you have Mr. Swales and Mina's friendship, and this friendship between people of different generations, and kind of the plot role he plays, but also this dynamic they have. And then Mr. Swales' friends in town. I know I didn't get into it, but he's described as having all these other old man friends there. Um, the friendship between Arthur, Dr. Seward, and the other suitor, Quincy, I forget his name. Their friendship, which is very subtle and only comes up in like little letters they write to each other, little notes. I'm curious what's going on there. How do they all know each other? But this idea of that kind of bonding, and then Dracula is always saying to Jonathan, like, "Oh, I don't want your friends to be worried about you being away, so write this letter to reassure them that you're fine." And uh, it makes me really curious about friendships throughout history and their dynamic. I was really interested about the intimacy of Mina and Lucy's relationship, and um, it makes me curious to know more about friendships of the time, how historically people have navigated friendship. That's not like part of this book, but I'm just personally like now I'm on this thought thread of like wanting to explore friendship from kind of a broader perspective, and how it shifts, because I think it really depends on your time, your social settings. I think being in late stage capitalism really affects our interpersonal relationships, and maybe that's why I'm so fascinated by friendship in this book. Um, I will also say I'm very curious about these weird animal like connections Dracula has in this book. You have the most stereotypical connection between vampires and bats, but obviously Dracula in this book has a relationship or command over wolves, and he moves like a lizard. He's seen getting off the ship as in the dog form. They describe a dog jumping off of the ship after it crashes. So this connection to animals is interesting, and I think it's been kind of streamlined in adaptations, mostly to be bats, but I think it's very curious. I'm very interested in that, and learning more. There's also, a lot about Dracula having this lineage of powerful warriors, and there's local history, and he gets into the history of the region, and I think, again, this idea of history and power and class. I think class and uh, how you follow your lineage and determine your class, especially for more old school aristocratic status, being an interesting factor in here. Um, Another thing that I didn't talk about in the plot description, but Mina keeps talking about this new woman. She describes things that a new woman might do or how a new woman might act. So I think there's this idea, this like social cusp of this change for women, and things are starting to change in how women present themselves and how they act in society. And obviously, this time there was a lot of repression, a lot of social expectations for men and women, but specifically women. Um, and I think that's really interesting that one of the main characters, as a woman, is discussing this. I haven't read enough to know, how that's going to pan out, or what kind of power Mina and Lucy might or may not have. So far, I think they're pretty, beholden to the limits that society has for women. Like Lucy being out at night by herself was so scandalous. But um, I'm also curious to see how that pans out, and to see how, in the face of this impending doom, and with her husband to be, sorry, being, sick, what would it be like for Mina? What as a woman in this narrative, and talking about women's behaviors and what's expected of them, what's going to happen? What is she going to face, and how's she going to handle it, and how is that going to shift? Same for Lucy. I'm pretty sure Lucy got bitten. I think Lucy's going to have a rough road ahead of her. I'm very sad. I don't know if she's going to make it to her wedding day. We'll see how that goes. I'm a little hesitant about her fate. So, sorry to be talking so much. Like I said, only the first part, and there's so much to be said. I'm very curious to hear what you think. And I hope you join me for part 2. We'll be reading the next section of the book. And maybe throughout the month, we'll be getting to some movie adaptations that I have not seen yet. I'm going to try to do a Twitch stream this week where I get on Sims 4 and I designed Dracula's house as if he asked me to buy some property for him, and I get full creative reign over his home using what I have available to me on my Sims account, making and designing his house. Because I think that'd be fun. I'm excited to make Dracula's dream home HGTV style. So hope you'll join me for that. But thank you if you're here, and I look forward to catching up on all the things happening with our cast of characters next time.